All right. So it looks like we have a few people joined us. Maybe we'll just give 30 seconds longer and see if anyone else joins us right now live.
I think we should begin.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to those of you who are joining us now, and thank you to Tales of the Cocktail and 86 Co. for setting this up and giving us a platform to have a conversation about gender intelligence with the bartending industry. Before we get started, I will introduce myself and give my co-host an opportunity to introduce herself. So my name is Stefan Kadakini, and I'm a senior associate with the Gender Intelligence Group. And the Gender Intelligence Group has been doing consulting work for the past 20 years on leadership and gender diversity and inclusiveness. And we worked with Fortune 500 companies, with Fortune 500 companies in nearly every industry. So to give you some examples, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Disney, IKEA, McDonald's, just to name a few. So a little bit more about myself. I am an entrepreneur. I started off in the hospitality industry as a cook, and then eventually a kitchen manager and a restaurant manager before I opened up my own bar and grill called Main Street Bar and Grill. And after that, I moved into the video game industry, which was another passion of mine, and I became a game designer and developer. Over the years, I founded 3 companies, one of which is with my wife. It's called Afton Lane Virtual Services, and I'm a father of 4 young boys. So not very much diversity in my family. The thing that gender intelligence has done for me, and I've been working with inside of the Gender Intelligence Group on and off for the last 10 years, but it's really had an impact on my leadership, throughout my career. It's had an impact on my teams and how I approach them, and I've really got to experience this work firsthand. So Suzanne, would you like to share about yourself?
Yeah, so happy to be with you all. My own background is having been in the communication business for about 25, 30 years, a long time. And I have been working with a number of organizations across the country, internationally. And my key message has always been to help people speak so others listen, and listen so others speak. And so I have worked with teams and leaders to help shape speaking and listening and general communication. How I came to gender intelligence most recently is in the context of my own work in gender diversity. One of my 2 kids has last number of years transitioned from female to male, and I have made it my business to become very involved and expert in the area of transgender, specifically transgender employment issues. And so I bring that discussion of gender diversity to expand that conversation in how we operate as male and female and along the gender spectrum. And so we'll be talking about the whole context of male-female communication. So very happy to be with you.
Great. So now, what is gender intelligence? So gender intelligence is really the understanding of gender differences. Now, one thing that I want to highlight here is it's not about men and women. We're really talking about gender traits, masculine traits versus feminine traits, and I'll get more into that later. But what we've learned is through the understanding of gender differences comes valuing those differences and actually being more inclusive around differences. We've also found that it produces to create inclusive cultures. So this conversation about gender differences transcends simply masculine traits and feminine traits and turns into a broader conversation around diversity and inclusiveness. So, more on this. We see gender intelligence as one of the most critical leadership competencies over the next 20 years. And this is reflected in many industries, but most recently the financial industry. Morgan Stanley, which is one of the leaders in wealth management and investment banking, just released a report in May advising their investors to look for diversity trends in the companies they invest in, because they found that companies that are more inclusive and more diverse have a higher return on investment. Gender intelligence is really based in neuroscience. So we've, over the 30 years, we've looked at the science research and it's still coming out. There's been this waterfall of research over the last decade, especially around this topic, highlighting the differences in the way that the male brain and the female brain are structured and the way that they function. And so again, this is not about stereotyping, and this is not about learning new behaviors to deal with the other genders. This is really about becoming authentic and valuing the differences that people have. And just on the stereotyping, as we go through this, I'll point this out multiple times, but really what we've learned is that men and women can be anywhere on the spectrum of male traits or tendencies and female tendencies. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. So this is about, and gender intelligence is about the advancement and retention of women and diversity at all levels. Again, I mentioned this is a bridged conversation into the broader diversity conversation. And it is key to unlocking the door to accelerating diversity in all cultures, which I've touched upon. So, there are 5 key advantages to a gender intelligent organization. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking at the organizational level or just at the team level or even personal level. The values transcend all of them. And what we found with the companies we worked with is when the team, the organization itself transforms, things shift, like retention, the retention of women, the satisfaction overall of employees. But that actually doesn't stop there. It moves into the marketplace and the consumers. When the team is more inclusive and diverse, they're more able to effectively service their customers or their clients. So more on gender tendencies. Now these bell curves here, these represent gender traits. On the right here, on the right side here, you can see the masculine trait, that bell curve, and the height in the middle here, that's where most men fall. And as you can see, some men fall further on the masculine side, and some men fall further on the feminine side. And same with the female side, or the female bell curve. Most women fall near the center. Some fall, more on the feminine side of traits, and some fall more on the masculine side of traits. And what's interesting here to note, and the research has shown this, is that 20% of the population fall in what we call bridge brain category, which is really in the middle here, where they have equal amount of feminine traits and an equal amount of masculine traits. And really the takeaway here is that there's a tendency for women to have a certain type of trait and a tendency for men to have a certain, to have certain traits. And anyone can fall into anywhere in this spectrum.
Okay, so you're probably thinking, so what does all this have to do with me? So where this conversation is going to go is it's going to help you identify what some of the blind spots are as men behaving with women and women behaving with men. There are lots of blind spots that we have, both in our language, in our attitude, and our behavior. And we want to take this awareness and bring it into the organizational level and see how this is playing out on a day-to-day level in your organization with your coworkers, with your customers and your clients. So the question we're posing to you now is, where is your organization on the gender intelligence continuum? And there are different aspects to look at. So from the 0 to 5, and I'm just going to pose these to you, and perhaps, unfortunately, we don't have an interactive platform today, and we're hoping, Stefan and I are hoping that this is the beginning of a conversation that you will continue to have with your coworkers and your leadership and your staff to look at where you are on this continuum. So on the left, on the one hand, ask yourself where you are. Are you an organization, or are you a person that says, you know, I just don't care. I'm just not interested in this stuff. I mean, it just doesn't have anything to do with me. Are you, and then we go to 1. We have to do this. That is sort of the mindset of saying, okay, so I know that there's some diversity. I know that there's some changes, and we really just have to deal with it. I don't really know what it's about, but we really have to deal with it. And then we move along to number 2. Are you in your organization the kind that will say, this is a good thing to do? I really recognize that there are some differences, some significant gender differences in how we behave, how we speak, and how we think that really has to be looked at for some valuable outcomes. Number 3, are you doing this because you have good business reasons? Because you recognize that, as the Morgan Stanley stat showed, that understanding gender differences really does have some very solid business outcomes. Would you consider yourself in transition? That is to say that you're already well along this conversation, and that you are making changes. I mean, kudos to you for even being on this call and being interested in the topic, because it's already an indication that you're aware of the difference and want to address it more succinctly. And then number 5, would you consider yourself as being authentically an inclusive company? That means to say that, no, we got it all together. We are really on top of our game here. So if you've got a pencil and paper, maybe just write down where you are on that 1 to 5 continuum of this conversation.
Right, and thank you, Anne, for sharing that we do have an interactive component, and that's inside of asking questions. So feel free as we present to ask us questions by using the Q&A component, and we'll do our best to get to them and the questions as they come up. So thank you again, Anne, for highlighting that. Great. Now, Suzanne, you want to continue with this one?
Sure. So as we begin to think about what this actually has to do with us, the question is, what challenges do you observe or experience between men and women? And here we now get into really asking the question, what does this have to do with me? So as you might expect, I'm going to talk more to the women's experience, and Stefan is going to talk more to the men's experience. So to the women's experiences, here's some of the top challenges for women. And you may have some in your mind, but these are the top 4 challenges that we have identified based on our research of what women experience in the workplace. So we often feel, I don't have to say they, I can say we often feel excluded in the conversation. Excluded, dismissed, expected to fit in, and ultimately devalued.
It really is.
And why do we feel this? Essentially, men and women communicate in very different ways. Men are convergent thinkers, women are divergent thinkers. Women want to have an experience of the conversation. They want to be inclusive of the conversation. Men want to land on solutions and just have the bottom line results. And so women are often feel excluded from the process of wanting to include. And because men will just want to get to the bottom line quickly and will exclude all the middle part. And so we'll feel as women that our getting to the journey part is not included and not valued. And so we'll feel dismissed in some ways. We'll feel dismissed because our voices won't be heard, our ideas won't be accepted. And I just, at this point, I just want to give you a very quick example of something that actually happened to me in a board meeting not very long ago. I made a suggestion, and you may recognize this. I made a suggestion of an idea, and I presented it, and I said something like, so what do you think about X idea? And so notice, what do you think about X idea? An invitation for a discussion. And it was heard mostly by the men at the table as sort of a general thought, and not, they sort of gave it a short shrift. They didn't really discuss it much. They sort of shrugged and moved on. Well, I can tell you about 10 minutes later in the conversation, a guy heard that, and he piped up and he said, blah, blah, blah is a really good idea. That was my idea, but he said it as a landed idea, not as an invitation to think about. And everybody, literally, the whole table changed. The guy sat up. They said, it's a really good idea. They leaned forward. They started talking about it as though it was that guy's idea. And I'm sitting back and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow. So that is, I don't know if you recognize that, but that happens so often. The third point, expected to fit in. Women often are expected to be one of the guys. And we are often expected, if not to be one of the guys, then to behave in a way that men recognize. And so you will often find women who feel that to get to the top, they have to be a man in a skirt sort of thing, where they have to be as aggressive, and they have to demonstrate the same behaviors as a man in order to, quote, fit in. And ultimately, this comes down to being devalued, not feeling that we are valued for what we're saying, how we're saying it, and who we are. And that often is the picture of women in the workplace.
Right. And the bell curves that I showed in the prior slide, the masculine side and the feminine side. One thing that I forgot to highlight is that the majority of companies out there, they operate from the male side of that spectrum. And it's not just a struggle for the female, it can be a struggle for the men as well. So when women are expected to fit in, it's not always a matter of fitting in with the men. It's also sometimes having a thick skin or thick armor. And I know this firsthand from my experience in the hospitality industry and working in a kitchen and knowing the dynamics of the kitchen and the way that the men would operate, and how those women who worked with us had to, deal with that. So the top challenges for men are feeling confused, having to be careful or walk on eggshells, dealing with emotions, and being blamed. So, these questions, the way that we pose these questions in our workshop, we actually separate the women and the men into two different rooms. And we actually ask them, what are the top challenges with working with the opposite sex? And they write down all these lists, and because it's just men and just women, they're very comfortable to voice honestly what it is that they deal with. And that's where we're getting these top challenges. We're getting them from the hundreds, the 100,000 plus participants we've had in our workshops over the last 20 years. So I see somebody post a question. Yeah, absolutely. So, the question is, for those of you, I'm assuming you can all read it, but it says, when women invite an idea for discussion only to have it dismissed, then reintroduced as a solution by a man, have you found that example in multiple industries? Absolutely, we have. You know, one of the beautiful things is that as I started doing some research on the bartending industry, and which I love doing because it's really where my career started. And my sister is actually a bartender. So I started doing some research and I was asking myself, like, am I going to see differences here than all these other industries that we worked with? And what I found is that no, you know, I'm not seeing differences in the trends and the statistics and in the research. And we're going to touch upon some of that, some of those stats. And I know Tails released a white paper with some stats as well. These are the same things we see in all industries. Now they fluctuate a little bit. They fluctuate a little bit in different countries. You know, if you go to Japan, what women have to deal in the corporate world in Japan is a little bit different because of the culture there than what they would deal with in North America. The science that I'm about to get into here, and then the statistics and the communication, we're going to talk about actual communication and give you guys some tools to help actually navigate some of these gender differences in your lives. We found these are foundational in all industries, in all cultures, in all countries. So, you know, really, really great question.
And if I can just add one thing before we move on to that.
Sure.
In my experience, I have found that those industries which are more male dominated and more bottom line driven, more solution driven, have a greater gender separation. So for example, the legal industry, legal field, where it's based on bottom line solutioning, is very geared towards the male communication style, male patterning, and undervaluing the process that women bring. And I know women have a lot of trouble in the legal industry because they're not as valued as men. At the board table, at the higher ends of boards of directors is where you find that often too. Whereas on the other spectrum of more creative fields where male-female differences are less specific in the art fields and in media, etc., this is less of an issue. Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing is it the industry that's creating that, or are the people who are attracted to the industry creating that? But that's a whole different discussion.
Right, and you know, I mentioned that my background, I work in the game industry as well, and I've worked with many teams inside the game industry on many projects, and I can tell you that there's some parallels between the video game industry and the hospitality industry. Actually work, they believe they're really inclusive and diverse. However, when you actually stop and look at the statistics and look at team makeups and dynamics, you realize that's actually not true. And one of the things that I'm really committed to is bringing this to the gaming industry as well. But it's really great when you have a look, when you have an honest look at not just your industry, but others as well, and you realize that although your industry is unique in some ways, it's not really unique in this way. This is something that all industries have to tackle and deal with. And what we found is that when companies do tackle and deal with this, that, you know, magic things really do happen inside of that transformation in the business, in the finances, everything. So now, like I said before, this is all based in science. So this happens to be one of my favorite parts. And I'm not going to get into all the science right now. This is something that, you know, we go over many hours in a workshop. It is a hugely important component to gender intelligence. It's the understanding of this science that gives you an understanding of the source of gender differences, and it opens the door up, like I said before, to valuing the different traits and the different ways of being that people can bring. If you want more information, our Facebook page or Twitter feed, you can go to our company website, genderintelligencegroup.com. We've also, we've released 4 books. The most recent one is called Same Words, Different Language. And all of those, you know, cover the science as well. So now what I am going to share is about this science is, you know, scientists have identified the different parts of the brain that impact things like how we perceive or solve problems, communicate, make decisions. How we de-stress is a really great one. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. And with the de-stress one, this one's really great because this one shows up in my life all the time. So men de-stress by shutting off, by actually shutting their brains off, and it's through that shutting off that our body and our brain is able to replenish our testosterone. And testosterone drives us, drives the male body in so many ways, from how we just manage stress and how we focus, sleep, all these things. Whereas for women, it's not the shutting off that they de-stress, it's through sharing and getting understanding. Women's, it's through that they get to replenish oxytocin, and their brain actually stimulates this replenishment through language and through sharing. So a couple quotes here before I move on. Actually, really, there's just one quote that I want to focus on, is the first one. Gender differences stubbornly emerge like dandelions on a chemically treated lawn. So Dr. Mary Ann Legato, she's a heart specialist, right? And she was challenged with doing research on why women were dying at a higher rate from heart disease than men. So when women were diagnosed with heart disease, they were dying at a way higher rate than men who were diagnosed with heart disease were dying. And so she started doing some research, and she was trained in the medical field like all of the doctors. And one of the things she was trained on is that there's not differences between men and women. So she went into this from that paradigm and asking herself, like, what am I going to find here? What do I need to look for? And so she started looking at the heart. And what she realized was our hearts are different. Our hearts are made from different proteins. And she asked herself, well, if our hearts are made from different proteins, what else is different? And it ended up bringing her to the brain. But just on the heart, what she realized was that all the medical research up to this point was always done on men. It was done on male humans, and it was done on male animals. And the reason why they chose to do it on men was because the female anatomy was seen as risky because of the hormones that shift on a monthly basis, because there's a possibility they could be pregnant. So they actually just made a decision to not test on women because there was too many variables, so they just tested on men. And what she found was that resulted in women dying at a higher rate because they were prescribing medicine and doses that were meant for men and male hearts. And when they were given to women, it wasn't effective, and women were dying. So this quote here, stubbornly emerge like dandelions, she's talking about all the medical research that now had to look at gender. And every time they avoided looking at gender, it would come up inevitably, and they would have to deal with it. So now let's look at a couple brain scans here. And remember how I said how men and women de-stress? So the male brain at rest looks like this. So this is a brain scan of the male brain, and you can see that white part, that's the active part of the male brain. So I'll give you an example. I come home from work, I sit down on the couch, I turn the TV on. That's what my brain looks like. It looks like this because it needs to get to this state to start producing testosterone and continue me being a healthy male. Now, a female brain at rest looks different. Here's a female brain at rest. There's a lot more activity. And the brain science shows that the female brain, and found this before children are even born, that these changes are wired into our brains. And again, I don't want to talk like these are definitive in all people. There are many different types of brains, and a female can have a male-looking brain, and a male could have a more female-looking brain in brain scans. But what this shows is that female brains tend to be a little more connected, and I'll get into a bit of that in a bit here. And it's this connectivity and this constant activity that has women deal with things like, for instance, de-stressing differently than men do. So question here from Anne, can you address some specific issues related to unconscious bias and how it works in the hospitality industry? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, we're going to get into that in a later section, and we absolutely will talk about that. And feel free to bring this question up again if you don't feel like we've addressed it. So
before we move off this slide, I just want to say, just put some other larger context in this, and women may recognize this if they, so if they've ever seen a guy just sitting and they say, "Oh, what are you thinking about?" And he says, "Nothing." Nothing. And it's absolutely true, because he has gone to this very small little portion of his brain activity. So he actually is thinking of nothing. We women are saying, how can you think of nothing? Because when we get relaxed, look what our brains are doing. They're really on steroids, even though they're in the resting state, because for us, we cannot go to nothing. It's very hard for us to go to nothing. And in fact, we are happier when we are, when our brains are kind of scanning what's going on. We look at different, when we're relaxing, we look at different aspects, what's going on at home, what's going on at work, what's going on everywhere. We tune in and we calm that area, but we feel more connected and calmer when we actually are tuned into areas rather than going to nothing. So right. Anytime a man says, "I'm thinking of nothing," he means it.
Right. Yeah, and I'm gonna share some stories where this comes up as well. Now, Suzanne, we just had a question about how does transgender enter into this?
That is so interesting. Yeah, what transgender essentially shows is the power and the importance of brain chemistry, because when a person feels that they are not connected to or comfortable in the birth that they have, or the gender that they have been assigned to at birth, and they want to move to another gender, it's not a whim. Nobody ever would want to walk that path unless they were driven to it. And the reason they are driven to it is because of their brain and body chemistry. So if we were, and I don't know where the research is at this point, but I know there is beginning research in trying to understand on a biochemical level brains of transgender or people along the gender spectrum. You will find somewhere, you will not find this diversity, this very big difference of female and male. It won't be as binary. It will be somewhere along the spectrum. And that's the whole thing about transgender, is that the person who is transitioning or wants to transition has a different brain chemistry. So it will look somewhere between the two of these, is what I can say.
Awesome. So the regions of the brain that I mentioned that impact the things like how we perceive the world, how we communicate, how we de-stress, these are the key areas of the brain. And again, like I said, this is something we go in very in depth in our workshops. We even show multiple videos from scientists talking about this science way more effectively than we can, since we're not scientists, although we're very passionate about this. I'm going to talk about one specific area and show you how this shows up in the real world. And I invite you to consider, where you fall in terms of your brain, because, like I said, there's a spectrum here, and although men tend to fall into a certain way and tend to have brains that look a certain, your brain could actually be anywhere in there. So the hippocampus is the area that I'm going to talk about, and this hippocampus is actually less active in men, and it deals with the management of memories and the ability to identify patterns. And so in women, the hippocampus is actually very active. It's actually so active that women instantaneously connect past events to current experiences. So when a woman has an experience, her brain automatically connects experiences. Now, an example of this from my life is sometimes I'm late. Sometimes I'm late and my wife isn't always happy about it. So, I'll give you one example where I show up, dinner's on the table, I'm 10 minutes late. I told her I was going to be on time and I'm 10 minutes late and I walk in the door and I'm thinking it's not a big deal. Like, it's just 10 minutes and she knows I was at work and there's traffic and that's just the way it is. And I walk in the door and she's actually, upset about it. And she starts talking to me about it. However, she's not just talking about this one time I'm late. She starts talking about the last 10 times I was late, because her brain has instantly connected all those past events and she's bringing to this conversation. Now, as a man, I feel, I'm feeling like I'm being attacked. And the reason why I'm feeling like I'm being attacked is because for me to connect those past events in my male brain, I have to put effort into thinking about it and I have to put effort into bringing up evidence to support the argument or whatever the breakdown is that I'm having in language, whereas she doesn't have to put that effort into it. It happens instantaneously. And the reason why this happens more often in women is because of this larger hippocampus. The reality is that I'm not being attacked and she's just sharing with me. And later slides, we're going to share some more examples as well as some techniques for actually navigating these types of situations. So why is this important to know? Suzanne, you want to?
Yeah. So again, so we've been talking about brain chemistry, brain behavior. So what does this have to do with us specifically? And I don't know if this is beginning to land on you, but I'm hoping that the things that we're talking about are beginning to trigger some questions in you. So the first question that we want to pose is, how long do women stay in the paid workforce? And so we're gonna ask a series of questions, and these series of questions that we're about to present to you are all about the different perception of men versus women related to specific aspects of our culture. So how long do women stay in the paid workforce? A, B, or C? And the answer is C. On average, women stay in the workforce 34 years versus men staying 37 years. So that's interesting. And just to point out that this is really a North American stat, because in Sweden, for example, the stat would be that over 88% of women work, and they stay more than 35 years in the workplace, in the workforce. So the perception is likely different, that women don't stay as long, but they stay almost as long as men. So it's pretty interesting.
And what we're seeing is that this is actually trending up. If we look 30 years into the future, given the way that our society is changing, the number actually is going to be way closer, if not parallel, with the number of years that men stay in the workplace on average. So the next question is, what percentage of men believe that both genders have an equal chance to advance in the corporate ladder? And by the way, the question on unconscious bias is something that we talk a lot about in gender intelligence, and really we're highlighting some of those here in these questions, as well as in the next section, which is on communication. So what percentage of men believe that both genders have equal chance to advance up the corporate ladder? A, B, or C? It's actually, A, B, or C, or D. It's actually D. 58% of men say that both genders have an equal chance to advance, which is really interesting.
And what percentage of women believe that both genders have an equal chance to advance? So if men thought 58%, women think it's 25%. Mm-hmm. So that is pretty interesting. Men have a different perception, clearly, a much more inflated perception than women do.
Of what a typical woman has to deal with, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the bartending industry In the white paper released by Taylor the Cocktail, in the survey done by nearly 1,700 bartenders and industry professionals, 47% stated that women have significant barriers. And so as you can see, now that's both men and women, and as you can see that those, that's actually really close to the average number you would see from men and women surveyed in other industries. So what is the top reason men leave companies? A, B, or C, or D? Men leave companies is A, better opportunity elsewhere. So this is interesting, and it's really interesting when you compare it to the top reasons women leave.
Yeah, so this is very telling. So the top reason women leave is A, B, C, or D? D, not feeling valued. And this is just so interesting. And to the person who asked about unconscious bias, this is where it starts to show up. So the thing about not being valued, we went through that. If you remember a few slides ago, we talked about the biggest challenges that women have and in the workplace, and it's not being valued. And it sends us away. It sends us into a feeling anxious, depressed, disengaged. And here's how it shows up actually in behavior. Women will often choose to leave the workplace and say that they don't have enough work, there's not enough work-life balance, or for personal reasons. And in fact, and that is so often the case. But what's happening there is that women are actually devaluing themselves and not conducting that conversation in an authentic way. They're actually leaving because they're not being valued, but they're saying they're not leaving, or maybe they're even feeling they're not leaving because they don't have enough time, too much time. At home requires too much time. If they were feeling more valued at work, there would be much more tendency for them to stay. So it's interesting how that's showing up. Mm-hmm.
And so the bartenders said 54% of those surveys stated that bias was the most significant barrier. And again, when you look at the statistics and the research done in other industries, this is extremely similar to what we see in all the other industries. So we're going to dig a bit more into this. In conflict, men and women have different emotional needs. Is this true or false? Well, it's true. Men seek space, women seek understanding. And this again, we're talking about tendencies here. Men tend to seek space. When I'm, faced with an argument or breakdown with my wife, and using personal examples again, and by the way, my wife is wonderful and she loves that I use these examples. When we have the breakdowns, I really want to have some space. I want space to be able to think about what it is that I did and come back and be able to deal with it. And she wants to talk about it. And so for this example, and this could show up in the workplace, it could show up in personal life. When there's a breakdown between a man and a woman, for a woman to understand that the man is going to tend to want to remove himself and get space from this issue before coming back and dealing with it is really powerful. And likewise, for men to understand that women want to seek understanding, and how those two can compete with, those two tendencies can compete with each other. When I have a breakdown with my wife, I can stop and listen. Listen to her and let her voice whatever it is she needs to voice and give her that understanding. And then I can go get my space and she knows that I need that. And then I can come back, and if I'm responsible, I can apologize and deal with it effectively, and we can move on.
So I just want to add one thing to that before we move on to the slide. I just want to talk a bit more about how that actually shows up in communication. So a lot of work I do is around communication and communication styles. And there is a significantly larger tendency for men to have as a communication style avoidance. So when there is a conflict, men will just want to avoid. They'll go into their corners. They'll hope it goes away. They'll neglect talking about it. They'll change the subject. They just will want to avoid the whole issue and talk about it later. Men often laugh about the worst, the most feared conversation opener from women, which is, honey, we have to talk. And it's the one conversation men don't want to start. So men have developed that communication style because of their need to seek space. Whereas women, they are great conflict managers. And I can tell you, being a mediator, women are so much better as mediators than men because they get how to have collaborative conversations. They get how to conduct conversations that seek understanding and that open up conversations, and so that people don't hide. They don't hide in their space. They come out and create collaborative, interest-based discussions.
Okay, great. We're falling a little behind here, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Were you good, Suzanne? Now, these questions and answers, these insights, I really challenge the viewers to consider how these insights actually can have an impact on the work that you do within your teams and within your customers, whoever that is that you service. Understanding that men and women deal with conflict differently, and so these next two I think really bring it to the forefront. So how many people, sorry, it's actually not the next two, it's the next 4 or so, but how many people do men tell of a negative experience? So to use my restaurant experience as an example, somebody comes to my restaurant and they have a bad experience and they leave. How many, for men, how many people do you think that they share of that experience afterwards? The answer is up to 3. So up to 3 other people, and only if it's relevant to the conversation. Again, if you think about that, men tend to need to put more effort to connect experiences together, whereas women, that happens automatically. You start to see why, it's only if it's relevant to the conversation.
And how many people do women tell? Up to 32. So lots could be said about this, but suffice it to say that women will speak about, whether it's relevant or not, they want to share if something has been negative for them. So the bottom line to this stat is that women are great brand communicators. They're brand ambassadors. So if you want your brand to be communicated effectively, make sure that women are really happy with the experience, because they will tell a lot of their friends.
Right. And what the research shown is that women don't buy brands. Women actually join brands.
Yeah.
And it's a really powerful thing to understand. And some of the companies we worked with, that understanding has transformed their business and their marketing and the way that they service their customers immensely. So men and women are just as sensitive to nonverbal communication, true or false? Well, this is false. Women tend to read the meta message and include facial expression and tone more often when they're listening to somebody than men do. And again, this is tendencies, and it's not that me as a man that I can't, pay attention to body language or facial expressions. However, it doesn't tend to come automatically to a man. It's something that the man has to put effort in, whereas for women, it's something that tends to come automatically.
We're wired differently. We are wired to pay more attention to a much more complex set of messagings at the same time. So we pick up the messages that happen covertly and overtly, messages that people are not aware of. So I would say that in this case, men, when you go to a meeting, ask the women what they noticed, because likely you will have missed a lot. Ask them what they noticed, and they will likely pick up a whole lot more. And the same thing with women. Women ask men what they noticed in a meeting, because you'll have missed some of the larger pieces that you didn't pick up.
Right. So just on a tiny bit more, when and I know Suzanne touched upon this, women tend to think in a divergent way, meaning they connect things outside of the conversation and bring them together. Whereas men tend to think very linear. In other words, like, there's a meeting, a team meeting, and a problem is presented. We have this problem, and the man's going to tend to think from problem to solution in a linear way, and then bring up facts that prove it a lot, that prove if what the problem is and what the solution is. Whereas women have a tendency to think more divergent and bring other conversations into this. Well, we have this problem, but how does it impact that team, or how does it impact our marketing or the consumer, and bring that in. And men, since men can be very linear, that can seem disruptive to us, but actually it's extremely valuable. And understanding the way that why it is that women think that way and bring that into the conversation, is really great. And then when those two ways of thinking, the very strategic, how do we get to the solution thinking, is inclusive of the divergent thinking, problems are solved in far more effective and creative ways. So now, the next question, what percentage of men aged 25-35 say they understand women? So that percentage, there's A, B, or C. That percentage is A. Only 9% of men say they understand women. And, I can speak on behalf of men here and say that this number is really low, but it's actually a really great number, because it's identifying that men are saying, well, there's actually a lot to learn. So, which is what we want. And one thing about gender intelligence is really about including men into the conversation. It's not simply about talking with women about the issues that women deal with. It's about including men in the conversation and actually looking at the challenges both genders have inside of this conversation. And that's where we really found the power is. And that's part of the reason why I'm presenting and why the gender intelligence group is made up nearly 50% of men. So the question, Anne, your question about the bartending industry and how bars and restaurants can be more inclusive. So, when we're looking at all these statistics, when we look at the brain research, and, I have to acknowledge that on a 60-minute webinar, it's a challenge for us to get on touch every topic. But when we look at this information, the statistics and the science, and we start to understand the impact that diversity can have on not just our teams, but how we service. So for instance, if there's a bar that or a restaurant that is really has a masculine culture and a theme to it, yet services 50% or more female clientele, the understanding of the value of diversity inclusiveness and the differences between men and women, particularly that example that we gave of women being brand ambassadors, it actually can cause a shift in the overall approach of these companies. Now, I'm not saying every single company is going to shift what they're doing, but what we found is that when companies actually start to understand the differences of these traits, it alters the business that they do. So I'll give you an example. American Express. We worked with American Express, and we worked at the executive level, training the leaders of American Express on gender differences. And what they did was they embraced it, and they started training the people underneath them, middle management, and it went all the way down to the call center. And what they realized was the way that they were dealing with their calls was actually a reflection of their internal culture that valued masculine traits. And they actually weren't servicing women effectively. And they started seeing that when they pulled the statistics and data. And they actually shifted their call center scripts so that their call center scripts were actually more inclusive in tone and in how they approached breakdown. And their statistics started to shift as a result. Another company is Dove. Dove serviced women forever. And that's what they did. That was their business. And what they didn't realize was that they were missing opportunities in marketing and servicing them because they were doing it from a masculine paradigm. So a shift that they did when they started including gender intelligence into their culture was they stopped marketing towards what they thought was the ideal woman, and that what women wanted to be was the skinny model. And they started shifting their marketing towards more realistic views of women, and it had a huge shift had a huge impact on their sales. The other thing they did was they started marketing towards men separately. They came out with a line of products for men. And again, you know, it all came from this understanding of gender, understanding of the differences, understanding of the challenges that men and women have in working together. And then that had an impact on their business as a whole. So for the bartending industry, you know, this is really where I see the value. I see the value in having this conversation around the differences and creating understanding, creating value, and creating inclusiveness in the teams that service the bartending industry and work in the bartending industry. I see that as being transformational serviced across the whole industry. So that was a really long answer. Now I'm going to move along here into the communication component. So what percentage of women age 25 to 35 say they understand men? You know, it was 9% for men. It's actually 68% for women say they understand men. And you know, this identifies both an opportunity and also the insightful nature that women tend to have just naturally, whereas men don't have that insightful nature naturally. We have to put effort into understanding things. You know, it comes more naturally to women the way that they observe us and how we conduct ourselves. Now, does that mean that the 68% don't have anything to learn? Absolutely not. And that's really what we've learned in gender intelligence, is that everybody does. So both men and women feel they need to improve their interpersonal skills. True. 92% of men and women say they can improve their interpersonal communication. And this is really, you know, this is really telling, and this is where the value of this work comes. The value of this work comes in those day-to-day interactions, and that's where we see this stuff show up when we're shifting cultures and companies, is in those day-to-day communications and interactions. And when we start getting feedback from our customers and the companies we work with, it's those day-to-day impacts. It's the overall level of satisfaction on a daily basis that transforms. So, Suzanne, you want to introduce the...
Sure. We only have a few minutes to talk about this, so we're just going to have to scream through this a little bit. But basically, how this shows up, the difference in how men communicate shows up in so many ways that we recognize and that we don't. And there are a lot of hidden areas that we don't know, that we have come to just take for granted. So as you can see, we've done a ton of research into this, and lots of tests, lots of workshops that we've presented and talked to people. And so we've come up with a few kind of conclusions about how men and women show up differently. So I would say that men, the language that you often hear in workplaces is so male-based. So, for example, how often do you hear people say, "Hey guys, you want to do this? You want to do that?" And that's so common. So if you say, "Hey guys," it means it's a casual, it's comfortable, everybody's happy. But nobody would say, "Hey girls," because that's just not appropriate. If you've ever been to a group of men and they say, men will identify them, just say to each other, "Okay, ladies, let's get together." Well, that is a humorous but a derogatory comment if they call each other ladies. Whereas women would say, "Okay, guys, let's all get together and talk about this." Simple, but seemingly innocuous, but really telling ways. There are, let's just go through some of these questions and help us sort of understand some of these male versus female approaches. So this is a really common one. So how men and women listen, nodding. No, nodding is so great. So when you listen, do you nod? Do you nod? And a lot of us nod. But nodding has very different meanings for men and women. So when a woman nods, she's following you and she's saying, yes, I understand what you're saying. She's not necessarily saying I agree, but it's our active listening approach that we're nodding. Yes, we're following along the conversation. Whereas a man, if he nods, it's tacit agreement. Yes, I agree. Okay. And that can be so disconcerting because if a man is talking to a woman and she's nodding, he thinks she's agreeing with an agreement, whereas she's just listened to it. And so the intention and expectation of that conversation can be skewed and completely misunderstood unless that nodding body language is clarified. Okay, the next one. Let's look at the next one.
Right. And so this isn't about this. This is really not about blaming men for any of this. It's we've gotten to the point where we've gotten, but in understanding this, the way that we listen differently, it actually comes from how we communicate. So when you look at how men listen, so how do men and women bring up ideas? The way that we communicate impacts how we interpret other people's communications is really the key here. So as a man, when I nod to say, yes, I agree with what you're saying, when I'm talking to somebody and they do it back to me, I assume that it means the same thing for them, when in fact, quite often it doesn't. So how do men and women bring up ideas? Women tend to make suggestions and ask for input from others as a dialogue starter, which is something that Suzanne mentioned, whereas men tend to bring up ideas directly, state the idea. As a game designer, I have to present ideas on a regular basis. And often I won't present my ideas until I've really thought through it. I've really thought through, confident in it, and then I'll bring the idea and pitch it. And again, to highlight Suzanne's point, this is part of what causes the breakdown in the meeting that she had, where she presented an idea, and then minutes later a man presented the same idea but presented it in a more definitive way, and then it became an action item that people moved on.
Right.
So yeah, we're gonna have to move a little quicker through these.
Yeah, so just really briefly, and this is such a common thing. So a woman will say when the phrase comes up, what do you think? It's an opening to a conversation where she wants to have the conversation. She wants to start. But when he hears, what do you think? He feels that he's being asked for opinion or a decisive comment. What do you think? Boom, I have to have an idea. No, don't come to a solution. A woman will say, just start the conversation. Let's just talk about it. And this very specific one is the result of so many arguments and disconnections between men and women, different intentions, different expectations of conversation.
So a colleague is experiencing a personal problem. She asks for details and discusses the problem to show concern and lend support, whereas he focuses on solving the issue or avoids the subject to demonstrate respect for the colleague's independence and privacy. And again, when we talk about how we communicate, I'm experiencing a personal problem, and I tend to seek space. So it makes sense that I would do the same. I would let others do the same.
So arguments are best supported. Men and women treat them very differently too. So a woman will use her personal experiences and the experiences of others. Again, it's the very large context where men tend to be much more right-brained, or rather left-brained, and we'll talk about facts, surveys, and so that again, it's very bottom line. And it becomes and so everything that we talk about, that we think about, is the difference between women seeking the journey and men seeking the solution and the end result.
Right.
Every aspect along the way.
So what defines a good, effective leader? So she says inclusive, influential, and able to get others to work well together. He says in control, concise, and able to get others to buy into his vision. And the only thing I'll say about this is both are extremely valuable, ways of leading. One would be seen as more valuable given the male paradigm that most teams and companies work inside of. However, what we're finding is the top leadership traits that are happening in the world right now, the ones that are highlighted as the most effective, fall into the female spectrum. There's actually a book called The Athena Doctrine that they interviewed, I believe, 1,000 people across the world that work directly with leadership, and they asked them this question, and more often than not, they highlighted feminine traits as being the most important. And it's not saying that women make better leaders. It's saying that those traits are seen as the most effective in this current day and age, mostly because they're not there as often, but when they are there, they create effective teams. And so what defines success? She says being valued while accomplishing. He says winning. You know, the results. It's not so much the journey that defines success, it's where we got to, not so much how we got there. Whereas for her, you know, again, when those memories and experiences are really connected together, you can see why it's the journey that's really important, and being valued as a component of that journey, not necessarily the result itself. So a summary of what men and women want. Women want understanding before action. Men want action. And then again, these are the tendencies. And just inside of this, the lack of understanding that women tend to want the understanding is a source of a lot of breakdown. So some powerful tools, just to wrap this up, for us all to take back to our lives and our teams is make no assumptions. When we realize that there are these different ways of interpreting communication that men and women both bring, you realize that for the example of nodding, we make assumptions. We automatically make them. If we didn't automatically make assumptions, our brain would be constantly trying to assess everything. And our brains don't do that. Our brains automatically interpret information so that it's easier for us to communicate on a day-to-day basis. And it's those automatic assumptions that happen that we need to be aware of, and we can actually stop making those assumptions and stand in the other person's shoes, really understanding, be understanding of others, be interested versus interesting. You know, one of the leadership traits that men fall into is they fall into that I have to be the leader. I have to look like the leader. I have to prove myself as the leader. And you know, more often than not, it's not an effective way to lead. Really be interested in what other people are dealing with and interested in developing other people's leaderships. And then declare your intention. Quite often, breakdowns in communication can be mitigated by simply declaring what your intention is. So, you know, my wife to say, hey, so I had this really breakdown at work, can I tell you about it? And I say, yeah, tell me about it. Now she knows that my tendency is going to be to find solutions and fix it for her as she's talking. You know, I may even interrupt her and say, hey, have you tried this? And she can say to me, you know, Suzanne, I just want you to listen, and I'm not looking for a solution to this. And then she can start talking. And you know, declaring your intentions up front is really powerful. So that's it for me. And again, you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. You can go to our website, genderintelligence.com. And for those of you joining us in New Orleans, I look forward to seeing you there and continuing this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.